So picture this, Midtown Manhattan, December 16th, 1985. It's like 5:26 p.m., the absolute peak of the holiday rush hour. The streets are just this chaotic sea of Christmas shoppers, yellow cabs, and exhausted commuters. Anyway, outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, the cold air is just biting. A black Lincoln Town car pulls to the curb. Inside sits a 70-year-old man who looks less like a street thug and more like, I don't know, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. In a way, he is. But as his driver steps out to open the door, the holiday cheer is totally shattered. Now, get this. 4 men step out from the shadows of the scaffolding. They're wearing matching light trench coats and black Russian-style fur hats. They draw semi-automatic weapons, and in less than 10 seconds, 16 shots ring out. The 70-year-old executive is practically cut in half, left bleeding out on the cold asphalt alongside his driver. The shooters vanish into the Manhattan crowds, leaving behind the most brazen, spectacular, and, at the time, baffling assassination the city had seen in decades. So when the cops arrived, they didn't find the body of some low-level enforcer or a desperate corner boy. The man lying dead in the street was Big Paul Castellano. He was the undisputed boss of the Gambino Crime Family, like the most powerful syndicate in American history. People thought they understood the mafia, you know? They thought the bosses were insulated, living behind high walls, totally untouchable by the law or their rivals. Castellano was supposed to be the Howard Hughes of the mob, a billionaire ghost who never got his hands dirty. So how does a man who controlled politicians, unions, and an underworld army end up slaughtered in the middle of a crowded street in daylight? Before the billions, before the wiretaps, and before the bloody concrete of East 46th Street, Paul Castellano was just a kid from the slums trying to find a way out. How did he build an empire so vast it rivaled Wall Street? And, more importantly, what blind spot allowed him to lose it all in a matter of seconds? Anyway, before we trace the blood trail from the slums of Brooklyn to the asphalt of East 46th Street, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Welcome to Breaking Omerta, where we pull back the curtain on the most secretive and ruthless syndicates in history. Join the family, because you're not going to want to miss a single detail of this hit. So to understand the fall, you really got to understand the soil he grew up in. Constantino Paul Castellano was born in 1915 in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn. Today, it's a neighborhood of million-dollar lofts and artisanal coffee shops, right? But in the 1920s, it was a brutal, unforgiving immigrant slum. Poverty wasn't just a circumstance, it was like the weather. It was everywhere. For the Italian immigrants crammed into these tenements, the American dream wasn't a promise. It was a totally rigged game. The legit paths to wealth were guarded by old money and systemic prejudice. If you wanted power, respect, or even just 3 meals a day, you basically had to take it. But young Paul was different from the neighborhood kids who spent their days brawling in the alleys. He didn't crave the violence. He had this really sharp, calculating mind. His father was a butcher, and Paul learned early on how to run a legit business, how to manage ledgers, squeeze a profit margin, and command workers. But a butcher's wages just weren't going to satisfy his ambition. And he had a massive advantage of the other street kids. His cousin was Carlo Gambino. Now get this, Carlo Gambino was a rising star in the underworld. He was quiet, ruthless, and brilliant. When Gambino took his young cousin under his wing, he didn't hand Paul a gun, he handed him a business plan. While other mobsters were making pennies running numbers and extorting local shopkeepers, Gambino showed Paul the real money, like the hidden economy. So in the 1940s, Paul used his background as a butcher to infiltrate the local meat delivery business. He didn't just want to sell meat, he wanted to control the entire supply chain. Through intimidation, bribery, and strategic union corruption, Castellano systematically took over the poultry and meat markets of New York.
If a supermarket wanted to sell chicken, they had to buy it from Paul's approved suppliers. If a trucker wanted to deliver that chicken, he had to pay dues to a union controlled by Paul. It was basically a masterclass in white-collar extortion. Anyway, this early success permanently altered Castellano's psychology. It gave him his first taste of absolute power, but it also planted the seeds of a fatal delusion. Paul stopped looking at himself as a gangster. He started looking at himself as a businessman, a literal CEO. He believed that the bloody, street-level violence of the mafia was beneath him. It was a tool for the uneducated, the brutes. So by the time the 1970s rolled around, Paul Castellano had insulated himself entirely from the grime of the Brooklyn streets. He built this sprawling 17-room mansion on Todd Hill in Staten Island. It looked exactly like the White House, complete with an Olympic-sized swimming pool and a driveway filled with luxury cars. He was making tens of millions of dollars a year off concrete, construction, and union dues. He was untouchable. But while Paul sat in his Staten Island fortress, sipping fine wine and acting like a Vanderbilt, an army of blue-collar enforcers out in Queens and Brooklyn were bleeding to keep his empire afloat. They were taking the risks, facing the prison sentences and fighting the rival gangs. And they were watching their boss take the lion's share of the profits without ever getting his hands dirty. Paul Castellano had successfully built his corporate empire, but in the underworld, an empire built on resentment is an empire waiting to burn. He was on top of the world, but he had no idea that his refusal to get into the gutter with his men had just placed a massive, invisible target squarely on his back. Now get this. To understand how Paul Castellano became the undisputed king of New York, you've got to look at the bloody mess of the old regime. In October 1957, Albert Anastasia, the feared boss of what would become the Gambino family, was gunned down in the barber chair of the Park Sheraton Hotel. Anastasia was a relic of the old world. He was the former head of Murder, Inc., a guy who solved every business dispute with a bullet. He was loud, he was violent, and he brought way too much heat from the cops. When the smoke cleared in that barbershop, Carlo Gambino stepped over Anastasia's corpse and took control of the family. And with him, the entire paradigm of the American Mafia completely shifted.
So, Gambino realized that the days of cowboy gangsters shooting it out in the streets were over. If the Mafia was going to survive the 20th century, it had to stop acting like a street gang and start acting like a Fortune 500 company. The violence had to be hidden, and the money had to look clean. This was the exact environment where a man like Paul Castellano was designed to thrive. Paul wasn't a trigger man, he was an earner, a master architect of white-collar extortion. Under Gambino's protection, Paul got the green light to expand the family's reach far beyond the slums of Brooklyn and directly into the arteries of the American economy. Anyway, in the 1960s and 70s, New York City was experiencing this massive construction boom. Skyscrapers were piercing the clouds, and millions of tons of concrete were being poured. Paul saw an angle that the old-school thugs completely missed. You didn't need to rob a bank if you controlled the men who built the bank. Castellano orchestrated what became known as the Concrete Club. He quietly took control of the Teamsters and the construction unions. Through a network of front companies and corrupted officials, he effectively held a monopoly on commercial concrete pouring in Manhattan. If a developer wanted to build a skyscraper in New York, they had to use a union-approved contractor, and those contractors secretly belonged to Paul. If they didn't pay the hidden mafia tax, the unions went on strike, the cement trucks stopped rolling, and the developers lost millions. So it was basically an invisible empire. Millions of dollars of untraceable cash flowed up to Paul's Staten Island mansion every single week. He was outsmarting the FBI, he was outsmarting the government, and he was making the Gambino family the richest, most powerful criminal syndicate in the country. But outsmarting the law is one thing. Outsmarting the wolves in your own backyard is entirely different. Now get this, by 1976, Carlo Gambino was dying of a heart condition. The undisputed boss was taking his final breaths, and a succession crisis was looming over the family like a dark cloud.
In the eyes of the streets, there was only one logical heir. His name was Agnello Dela Cruz, known as Neil. Dela Cruz was the family's underboss. He was a terrifying, old-school gangster who operated out of the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan's Little Italy. Dela Cruz commanded absolute loyalty from the blue-collar faction of the family, the hitmen, the hijackers, the loan sharks. These were the men bleeding on the pavement to keep the family in power. To them, Dela Cruz was a god. He was one of them. It was like an unspoken law of the underworld. When the boss dies, the underboss steps up. But Carlo Gambino didn't care about the rules of the street. He cared about the money, and he cared about blood. On his deathbed, Gambino bypassed his fiercely loyal underboss and totally stunned the entire underworld. He named his cousin, the wealthy, isolated, white-collar businessman, Paul Castellano, as the new boss of the Gambino crime family. So the coronation of Paul Castellano was the ultimate paradigm shift, and it was a massive, unforgivable insult to the men in the trenches. Suddenly, the toughest, most violent crew in America was taking orders from a guy they viewed as a pompous, greedy aristocrat.
Castellano didn't hold court in a social club. He made his capos drive out to his Staten Island mansion, forcing them to wait in his velvet-lined study like naughty school children reporting to the principal. To keep the peace, Paul threw Dela Cruz a bone. He allowed Neil to remain as underboss and keep control of the street-level crews. It was a compromise meant to stabilize the family, but in reality, Paul had just drawn a line right down the middle of his own empire. Anyway, Paul reached the absolute pinnacle. He possessed the money, the territory, and the ultimate title. He was the boss of bosses, but he was sitting on a throne of resentment. He'd alienated the most dangerous men in his organization, assuming his wealth and his title made him untouchable. He was on top of the world, but in this life, every crown comes with a target, and the guy who was about to lock onto that target wasn't the FBI. It was a loud, ambitious, and incredibly dangerous young capo from Queens who was tired of taking orders from a ghost. So, if Paul Castellano was the corporate boardroom, John Gotti was the bloody pavement. Down in Ozone Park, Queens, operating out of a heavily fortified storefront called the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club, a fiercely ambitious captain was building his own army. John Gotti was everything Paul Castellano despised. He was loud, he wore flashy $1,000 bespoke suits, and he absolutely loved the spotlight. He was a protege of Agnello Dela Cruz, the passed-over underboss, and he carried the resentment of the entire blue-collar faction right on his broad shoulders. To Gotti and his crew, Paul wasn't a gangster. He was a pompous, greedy aristocrat who demanded a massive cut of their hard-earned street money while looking down his nose at them. But resentment alone doesn't start a war. A war needs a spark. And in the 1980s, that spark was heroin. Now get this, Castellano had implemented an ironclad, non-negotiable rule within the Gambino family: no dealing drugs. The penalty for breaking this rule was absolute. It was death. It wasn't a moral stance, it was just a desperate act of self-preservation. The federal government had just rolled out the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Under RICO, if a low-level soldier got caught slinging heroin, the feds could use that crime to indict the boss who took a cut of the profits. Facing 20 years to life in a federal pen, street-level mobsters were suddenly flipping and becoming informants at an unprecedented rate. Drugs were a liability Castellano simply refused to tolerate. But here was the fatal hypocrisy that drove John Gotti insane. Paul Castellano demanded his massive envelope of cash from the crews every single week. He didn't ask where the money came from, but everyone in the room knew it was drug money. Paul wanted the profits of the heroin trade, but he demanded total insulation from the risk. So behind the boss's back, John Gotti's crew, specifically his brother Gene and a loudmouthed, heavy-set mobster named Angelo Quack Quack Ruggiero, were moving massive quantities of heroin.
They were playing a deadly game of Russian roulette, hiding a multi-million-dollar narcotics ring from the most powerful crime boss in the world. The tension was already at a boiling point, but neither Paul nor Gotti realized that a third player had just entered the board, and they were listening to everything.
Anyway, in the early 1980s, the FBI formed Squad 16, a unit dedicated entirely to destroying the Gambino crime family. Led by Special Agent Bruce Mao, they knew that flipping low-level guys wasn't going to bring down a corporate mastermind like Castellano. They needed to hear the boss himself. They needed to breach the fortress. In March 1983, the FBI pulled off one of the most audacious black bag operations in the history of law enforcement. Waiting for Paul to leave on vacation, a team of specialized techs bypassed his state-of-the-art security system, sedated his guard dogs, and broke into the Todd Hill mansion. They didn't plant the bug in the study or the basement. They knew Paul held his most intimate, secret meetings at his kitchen table. The agents drilled a tiny hole into the base of a lamp sitting right on the breakfast island, inserted a mic the size of a dime, and wired it into the house's electrical system. So, for months, the FBI listened as the boss of bosses incriminated himself. He spoke in hushed, corporate tones, outlining his control of the concrete unions, ordering extortions, and casually discussing the murders of rivals over coffee and English muffins. The federal trap was snapping shut around him. But it wasn't the FBI's bug in Castellano's kitchen that ignited the powder keg. It was a completely different FBI wiretap planted on the phones of John Gotti's crew down in Queens. Now get this, Angelo Ruggiero had a fatal flaw. He couldn't stop talking on the phone. The feds easily recorded him discussing the massive heroin operation and, even worse, relentlessly mouth-mouthing Paul Castellano. When the government indicted Ruggiero for narcotics trafficking, legal procedure required the prosecution to hand over the audio tapes to the defense team. This was the exact moment the blood drained right out of John Gotti's face. So the tapes were now public record, and Paul Castellano wanted to hear them. The boss summoned his underboss Neil Delacroce and issued a terrifying ultimatum: bring me the Ruggiero tapes. Castellano knew exactly what was on them. He was laying a trap. If he heard Gotti's crew dealing drugs on tape, he'd be forced to execute them all to maintain the rules of the family. If Gotti refused to hand over the tapes, it was an act of open rebellion, and Paul would have them killed for insubordination. It was a flawless checkmate. John Gotti, his brother Gene, and Angelo Ruggiero were dead men walking. Anyway, there was only one thing keeping the peace, one fragile barrier standing between John Gotti and a firing squad: Neil Delacroce. Delacroce managed to stall Castellano, begging him to wait, pleading with the boss not to slaughter his own men. Out of respect for the old gangster, Paul agreed to wait, but time was running out. By late 1985, Delacroce was dying of brain cancer. Every labored breath the underboss took was a tick off the clock for John Gotti. The cat and mouse game was over. The stakes had fundamentally shifted. For John Gotti, this wasn't about money anymore, and it wasn't about territory. It was strictly about survival. The moment Delacroce's heart stopped beating, Gotti knew Castellano was going to send the hitmen. So, the ultimate betrayal is already in motion, and the streets are about to catch fire. If you're hooked on this deep dive into Mafia history, take 1 second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications for Breaking Omerta. We're just getting to the point of no return. Now, let's get back to the trap.
To survive, Gotti had to do the unthinkable. He had to break the oldest, most sacred rule in the history of the American Mafia. He had to kill his own boss, without permission, without warning. Now, get this. On December 2nd, 1985, the ticking clock finally ran out. Agnello Delacroce, the fiercely loyal underboss and the only guy holding the Gambino family together, died of brain cancer. For John Gotti, the shield was gone. He knew that without Delacroce's protection, Castellano would inevitably disband the Queen's crew and likely have Gotti and his brothers killed over the unauthorized heroin tapes. But then, Paul Castellano made the final, fatal mistake of his life, a mistake born entirely of his corporate arrogance. So, in the Mafia, respect is the currency of the realm.
Della Croce had served the family for over 4 decades. He was beloved by the streets, but when the day of the wake arrived, the undisputed boss, Paul Castellano, didn't even show up. Castellano claimed he stayed away to avoid FBI surveillance, but the street-level crew saw it for what it was, the ultimate insult. The billionaire boss couldn't even be bothered to pay his respects to the man who built his empire. To pour salt in the wound, 2 weeks later, Castellano completely bypassed Gotti's faction and named his own loyal bodyguard, a brutish, universally disliked enforcer named Thomas Bilotti, as the new underboss. Anyway, for Gotti, it was the perfect storm. Castellano hadn't just signed his own death warrant, he'd handed Gotti the exact political leverage he needed to execute it. Gotti used the disrespect of Della Croce's funeral to whip the blue-collar captains into a murderous frenzy. But killing a boss is the most dangerous maneuver in the underworld. You don't just walk up and shoot a guy like Paul Castellano. You gotta trap him. And to trap him, Gotti needed a Judas. So, he found his Judas in Frank DeCicco. DeCicco was a highly respected captain who was closely allied with Castellano, but secretly his loyalties belonged to the streets. DeCicco convinced Castellano that they needed to hold a sit-down to smooth over the tensions regarding the new underboss. Castellano, always viewing himself as the corporate mediator, agreed. DeCicco set the time and the place, December 16th, 5 p.m. The location was Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. The trap was set. Now, Gotti had to build the firing squad. Now get this, Gotti assembled a hit team of 4 men, but he didn't use the legendary old-school hitmen of the family. He chose young, hungry shooters who were fiercely loyal to him. They needed to blend into the holiday crowds, but they also needed to cause maximum confusion for the eyewitnesses. They settled on a bizarre but highly effective uniform, matching light-colored trench coats and black Russian-style fur hats. If anyone asked, the cops would be looking for a Russian hit squad, not Italian mobsters from Queens. So, it's the late afternoon of December 16th. Down the street from Sparks Steakhouse, John Gotti and his right-hand man, Sammy the Bull Gravano, are parked in a dark Lincoln sedan with heavily tinted windows. They're the field generals watching the board. On the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the 4 shooters in trench coats are leaning against the scaffolding, trying to blend in with the throngs of Christmas shoppers and office workers hurrying home. Backup shooters are positioned down the block, ready to intervene if Castellano's bodyguards return fire. The air is freezing. The tension in the street is suffocating. And then, the call comes in over a 2-way radio. He's blocks away.
Anyway, inside his own Lincoln, Paul Castellano is annoyed. Traffic is a nightmare. He hates coming into the city during rush hour. He has absolutely no idea that every decision he's made over the last decade, the greed, the insulation, the arrogance, the refusal to respect the men bleeding for his wealth, has culminated in this exact intersection. At 4:26 p.m., the black car finally pulls up to the curb on East 46th Street. So Thomas Bilotti, the newly appointed underboss, puts the car in park. He steps out of the driver's side and walks around to open the door for his boss. Castellano pushes the heavy car door open and steps his right foot onto the pavement. He looks up. Now get this. For a fraction of a second, the boss of bosses sees them. He doesn't see rival gangsters, he doesn't see the FBI, he sees his own men. The silence of the street is totally shattered. 16 shots tear through the freezing air. Castellano is hit multiple times in the head and chest before his second foot even touches the ground. He collapses backward, his pristine, tailored suit instantly soaked in blood. On the other side of the car, Tommy Bilotti is gunned down just as ruthlessly, his body crumpling onto the asphalt. So panic erupts. Shoppers scream and dive for cover. The 4 shooters tuck their weapons into their coats, seamlessly dissolving into the terrified crowds, disappearing like ghosts into the Manhattan night. Seconds later, John Gotti's tinted Lincoln slowly rolls down East 46th Street. Gotti peers out the window, looking down at the bloody, lifeless body of Paul Castellano sprawled in the gutter. He has to see it with his own eyes. He confirms the kill. The car accelerates down 3rd Avenue, fading into the city traffic. Anyway, in less than a minute, it was over. The greatest, most insulated corporate mastermind the American underworld had ever seen had been slaughtered in the street like a common thug. The king was dead, and the guy who pulled the strings was about to step into a spotlight so bright it was going to burn the entire mafia to the ground. So the assassination of Paul Castellano sent an immediate, seismic shockwave through the global underworld. A boss hadn't been murdered in the streets of New York in nearly 30 years. It was an act of supreme defiance, of violent rejection of the corporate era of the Mafia. And everyone knew exactly who pulled the trigger. Within weeks, the Gambino captains were summoned to a secret meeting. There wasn't any debate, there wasn't any voting. The street faction had won the war. John Gotti, the fiery, ruthless captain from Queens who'd orchestrated the hit to save his own life, was officially crowned the new boss of the Gambino crime family. But when Gotti took the throne, he didn't retreat to a walled-off mansion on Staten Island like Castellano. He did the exact opposite. He stepped directly into the blinding flashbulbs of the American media. Gotti loved the cameras, and the cameras loved him. He became the Dapper Don. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, strutting down the sidewalk like a Hollywood celebrity, shaking hands and giving sound bites to reporters. When the government brought him to trial for racketeering and assault, he beat the charges, earning a new nickname, the Teflon Don. To the public, Gotti's flamboyant arrogance was the ultimate insult.
Now, get this. Agent Bruce Mao and FBI Squad 16 had spent years building a flawless, airtight case against Paul Castellano, only to watch John Gotti literally blow it to pieces on the pavement of 46th Street. They were furious, and they immediately redirected the full, terrifying weight of the federal government directly onto Gotti's shoulders. Castellano had been destroyed by his isolation and his arrogance. John Gotti was about to be destroyed by his ego and his mouth. So, Gotti believed his own myth. He thought he was smarter than the feds. He knew his club was bugged, so he started holding his most sensitive meetings in a seemingly secure apartment located 2 floors above the Ravenite. He thought it was a safe haven. He was totally wrong. In the dead of night, the FBI broke into the apartment and planted the most devastating wiretaps in mob history. For months, they listened as Gotti, basking in his own power, relentlessly trashed his own men. He complained about their greed, he mocked their intelligence, and worst of all, he openly discussed the murders he'd ordered. History was repeating itself with terrifying precision. Just like the Ruggiero tapes that doomed Castellano's reign, the government now had Gotti's own voice on magnetic tape. But this time, the tapes held a much darker secret. Anyway, on those tapes, John Gotti shifted the blame for multiple murders onto his fiercely loyal underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gotti was setting Sammy up to take the fall if the government ever came knocking. When the FBI finally raided the Ravenite and arrested the top administration of the Gambino family, they played those tapes for Gravano. So, imagine the profound, tragic irony. John Gotti had murdered Paul Castellano because Castellano refused to protect his men from the FBI. Gotti justified the assassination of a boss by claiming he was saving the blue-collar soldiers from a treacherous, greedy CEO. Now, half a decade later, Gotti was caught on tape planning to betray his own underboss to save his own skin. For Sammy Gravano, the illusion of honor among thieves shattered completely. Realizing his boss was willing to throw his life away, Sammy Gravano did the unthinkable. The highest-ranking member of the American Mafia to ever break the oath of Omertà, Sammy the Bull Gravano, flipped. He agreed to testify against John Gotti. Now, get this. On April 2nd, 1992, the Teflon Don was found guilty on all charges, including the unsanctioned murder of Paul Castellano. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti spent the rest of his days locked in a tiny concrete cell in a federal supermax facility, far away from the bespoke suits, the flashing cameras, and the cheering crowds of Little Italy. He died of throat cancer in 2002, a withered, forgotten remnant of a bygone era. So, when Paul Castellano stepped out of that black Lincoln in 1985, he wasn't just walking into an ambush, he was stepping into the end of an era. The hit at Sparks Steakhouse was the climax of the American Mafia. It was a spectacular, fiery explosion that commanded the world's attention. But the fire burned way too hot. John Gotti's coup brought the full wrath of the federal government down upon the 5 families. ushering in an era of wiretaps, RICO statutes, and mass betrayals that the mob would never recover from. Paul Castellano spent his entire life trying to run the mafia like a civilized, untouchable corporation. He wanted to be remembered as a businessman. Instead, he's remembered as the man left bleeding in the gutter, the spark that ignited the destruction of his own empire. Anyway, in the end, what do you think was the fatal flaw? Was it Castellano's corporate arrogance, completely ignoring the men who built his wealth? Or was it Gotti's blinding ego, thinking he could murder a king and face absolutely no consequences? Let me know your verdict down in the comments. So, if you want to keep exploring the brutal truth the underworld tried to bury, make it official and subscribe to Breaking Omerta. We've always got more files to open. If you want to dive deeper into the underboss who brought the whole thing down, click the video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.